very fascinating subjects this afternoon. But I'm guessing you guys must be the die-hard interested in different zodiacs crowd, and that's why you came here. So, sidereal versus tropical, can there be more than one? On this slide is a picture of the goddess Ishtar from the Mesopotamian civilization, and to the right is Durga from India. And when I first came across these images, I thought, boy, they look awfully similar in their iconography, and interesting, and I thought, is there a connection between them? So some scholar has worked out a connection that sort of links Ishtar to Durga, and you can see the fall of Ishtar as a worshipped goddess in Babylon, and the rise of Durga in India. And this really has nothing to do with the Zodiacs. It's just sort of the free show to entertain you while the latecomers come. But I just thought it was interesting. But it does illustrate the concept of can there be more than one? In other words, whatever it is that's represented by both Ishtar and Durga, you know, there's more than one. Okay, so for those of you that are tired after lunch and just want to get straight to the answer, obviously there is more than one, because we have astrologers using tropical zodiac and we have astrologers using the sidereal zodiac, and there are excellent astrologers in both camps. So why is that? Or what's going on with that? And what is the connection between the sidereal and the thing? I threw this slide in because I once gave this talk, and at the end of it, someone said, "Are you an astrologer?" And actually, I forgot to introduce myself, but that's why that slide is there. So I'm Kenneth Miller. I'm a professional astrologer from San Diego, California, and I do Indian astrology, or Vedic astrology it's sometimes called, which does use the sidereal zodiac. But I've got a master's degree in the history of astrology, and I've studied with all these people, and I'm bilingual in both systems. And I was invited to this conference to kind of give these history-type lectures, which I've been doing all week. Okay, so just to remind you that the traditional way of viewing things has the Earth in the middle and things revolving around us. And I went over this in yesterday's talk on the houses. I'm not going to repeat it, but just to kind of put us in the mind frame of the peoples that developed horoscopic astrology. That is the astrology of casting a chart for the moment someone was born. The world they lived in was a world where the Earth was the center and everything was revolving around it. Okay. So we say tropical versus sidereal, but there are actually three zodiacs. There are the actual constellations in the sky, or what we call constellations and what ancients called constellations, and they're not equal sizes. Aries is teeny compared to something like Virgo, which is giant.
Kenneth?
Yes. Right now? Oh, you have the mic on now? Okay. Oh. Is that better, or did you like me down there? Doesn't matter. Is this for the camera?
Camera's cool.
All right. So do I have to stand up here? I guess when I feel I have to make a really important point, I'll maybe jump back up here. The echo is good. But I'm not sure we need it since we're just such a small group. But if you have trouble hearing me or my voice goes down in 15 minutes, let me know and I'll jump up there. So the first zodiac is constellational zodiac, and they're uneven sizes. The second zodiac is the sidereal zodiac, which divides the sky into 12 equal sections, starting with the first star of Aries and just marking out 30-degree increments. And in fact, the Sanskrit word that's used in Indian astrology that means signs is rashis, which is actually like a heap of things put together. That's one of the meanings of rashis. It's like a heap of things. And then, of course, we have what probably most of you use is the tropical zodiac, the zodiac you know and love from Western astrology, that's based on the first day of spring being the beginning of Aries. I'm sorry, down here it would be the fall. which we'll come back to a little bit. These were all Northern Hemisphere people developing these theories about why things should be the way they are. So down here, your Aries would start on the first day of fall, but in the Northern Hemisphere, it would be the first day of spring, and you just divide the year equally by time into 12 segments. That's where we get the signs of the zodiac. Now, every few years, I was talking to Rob Hand about this, every few years you get some scientists saying, those astrologers are nutty, they don't even know what they're talking about, the constellations are nowhere near the signs. True, but astrologers have always known that. I mean, in ancient Greece, they knew that something weird was going on, and the seasons were not like connected to the star positions, but they chose, for reasons we'll go over to shortly, they chose to use the tropical zodiac. That was a conscious decision, it wasn't an accident. So I'm just telling you this in like 5 years from now, it becomes an issue again. No, it happens. So I first gave this talk to an American audience. So there used to be a television show called The Highlander, and also movies.
Yeah, we had it here too.
You had it here too. Okay. So the plot was basically a bunch of immortals who had to, for some reason that didn't quite make sense, to be honest, they had to kill each other because at the end of the day there could only be one immortal. And I have met astrologers who feel that there does have to be one or the other. And they're on the internet, they are out there. They'll make a case for either the tropical or sidereal being the, quote, right zodiac. Hopefully, you will not fall into this category when we're done, and you'll have a more nuanced and deeper understanding of both the zodiacs. That's my whole point. By the way, if you have a question at any time, feel free to interrupt me, not a problem. So, Highlander model is there can only be one, but we're going to go over this. So, everyone has an astrology. What I mean by that is every culture looks up at the sky and figures something out in terms of how it relates to what we're doing down here. Unfortunately, Kenneth Johnson couldn't be here, but he would have gone into Mayan astrology, which is a Mesoamerican tradition. But pretty much every culture looked up. I mean, there was, no internet, nothing to do once the fire went out. So you looked up and you saw stuff, and often you'd make up stories and you'd notice things that were happening. So everyone has a kind of astrology. But something weird happens in the region of where the Hellenistic Empire was, and I'll show you a map in a second, and India. Both of these cultures develop the idea of casting a horoscope, which is defined as casting a chart for the moment you're born. That idea arises at kind of the same time in both places. And another weird thing is that at the time the idea of casting a horoscope was thought of, the first star of Aries and the first day of spring lined up, more or less. It's just a weird coincidence of time that when we got the notion of horoscopes, which Rob corrected our use of that, but I mean that's our common use of that word, the birth chart idea, it just so happened on the first day of spring as the sun rose, behind the sun was the first star of Aries. Now, what happens is the earth wobbles in a weird way, and so it appears like the stars, well, from the tropical astrologer's point of view, it looks like the stars are moving backwards in relation to the first day of spring. The siderealists will say it looks like the seasons are moving forward in relation to the stars that don't move. That's the hula hoop. We might come back to them later. They were used in my lecture yesterday. I'll just briefly go over this because this has sort of been talked about in other lectures, but the models that underlie astrology as we know it, it starts with, and you can, India or Mesopotamia, Babylonian, it was, you paid attention to the sky because you had a relationship with the gods, with the deities. And you wanted to know what they were thinking and what they were doing. In India, they would time rituals because certain sections of the sky were associated with certain ancient Vedic deities. In ancient Babylon, Mesopotamia, the planets were their gods, and so they were watching them, looking for weird stuff, noting exactly how they moved, and when something seemed a little peculiar, they'd go back into their records and go, oh, last time this happened, we had a famine, better tell the king, let's prepare for it, or let's negotiate with the gods. It's like a negotiation model. So, a historian once said, you know, the Babylonians were watching the sky for a couple of thousand years, and we know that because they wrote on like stone and clay, which survives the ravages of time, and we have tons of the stuff that has survived. These observational records and messages to the king. So, but why didn't they in all that time think to cast a chart? And the first paper I ever wrote in my master's degree was, well, it's obvious to me, why would you cast a horoscope if everything was negotiable? You know, a message is coming down that something bad's going to happen. Oh, we just do a couple of rituals, placate, and everything's going to be fine. It's only when you have either a fate concept or a karma concept that now you want to know what that is. If you're born in a culture that says you have a certain fate, the three fates weave together. You know, Plato in Book 10 of the Republic, this warrior named dies on the battlefield, and they're about to burn him, and he comes back, and he goes, ah, I saw what happened. And he tells the story of going up, seeing everyone lining up to be reborn, picking the life. It was like, the way it's described is like you would pick a life script, and some people would just say, oh, successful businessman, I want that one, and wouldn't like read the details about how miserable that life was. And other people would take their time, really read the script and go, yeah, I want this one. And then they'd go to their past the three fates, and get fated to that life, and then boop, down, reborn. So this is like a popular myth in the Greco world. And on the Indian side, of course, there's, you know, reincarnation and karma. You're carrying stuff from life to life. Things that happen to you in this life are the result of previous life karmas. In both those situations, if I had a technology that said, oh, I can tell you what that is, I can tell you what your fate is, I can tell you what your karma was, you would want that. And that's why I think in those two cultures we get the idea of horoscopic astrology. Okay, so this Greek guy, Hipparchus, if I'm pronouncing his name right, was born, remember dates run backwards BCE, so from 190 to 120. He's sort of considered the founder of, quote, the tropical zodiac. So he said, you know, I think it would be easier, might it be more convenient to measure the zodiac from the seasons? You know, that way we're not having to like really like figure out where all the stars are and stuff. And so he's considered sort of the founder of the tropical zodiac, and then he's followed, okay, and then these two guys noticed that there was a difference between the first day of spring and the first star of Aries, and they noticed it was moving. So in the ancient Greek world, when astrology was in the West was first developed, I'm going to stop saying horoscopic astrology. Now when I say astrology, I'm talking about what we all do. They noticed that there was something weird going on. They didn't know, now we know it's a one-way trip that takes like 26,000 years, but they thought there might be a wobble back and forth. And actually they thought that for quite some time. There's some medieval literature that talks about that as well. And, but they noticed that there was, you know, things were not quite lined up. But this guy was like, hey, let's just make the zodiac from the seasons. And then, of course, Ptolemy writes the Tetrabiblos, which is basically a kind of scientific explanation for why astrology works. And he says, this is where you get the idea that, oh, Aries is Aries-like because it's also springtime. So, you know, things are springing into life. That kind of corresponds with Aries. And he makes this sort of seasonal connection between all these signs, tropical signs. Tropical just means seasonal, the seasonal zodiac. That's what Western astrologers use. So he comes up with this rationale that kind of sticks. But, I mean, if you really believe that that's the rationale, then you guys, Australians, everyone in the Southern Hemisphere would actually need to start Aries on your first day of spring. Now, there was a movement in Australia in the 80s. There were a few gadfly astrologers that advocated this, never caught on. And I've never found anyone that's like done it that way. And then you'll hear, other counter arguments as to why it should be, March 22nd. But whatever it is, that's where we get the kind of rationale for the tropical zodiac. Valens, the earliest Greek writing author whose entire corpus survives, he uses the tropical zodiac, and pretty much everyone in the West uses the tropical zodiac, including you if you're a Western astrologer, unless you do Western sidereal astrology, which is, I don't actually have a slide about this, but there was a movement in the middle to 3/4 of the 20th century where there were some Western siderealists, Fagan Bradley, they thought, oh, we should use the sidereal zodiac for Western astrology. There are still people that do that. They're in the minority. I'm not going to really talk about it.
Does it work?
They say they would. So there's a lot of Kenneths in the world of astrology. Kenneth, what is his last name? He's like the living advocate, does online seminars, just came out with a book, and he diehard goes into sidereal. But he jettisons a lot of other Western astrology stuff to make it work. When I gone through what he's doing. So, but he swears by it. I mean, one of the mysteries of astrology is how does all this stuff work when it seems to contradict each other? And I'm going to try to answer that question later. But that's Western sidereal. But I'm kind of not going to address that in this talk. Okay. I go until 4? Okay. So, you've been getting some of Western astrological history. I'm not going to belabor this, so we're just going to do a minute of it. It starts in Babylon. This is interesting. So the ancient Babylonians, and this will come, when we talk about the zodiac, this will come into effect too. They looked at the sky without any notion of geometry. Like when we look up, we see a dome. We think of round things. We think of orbits. I mean, that's instilled in us from a young age. Imagine not knowing any of that. Imagine you're just looking at the stars and you're working out that Venus repeats itself every 8 years, not because of some orbital thing, but just through the mathematics of tracking it. You're noticing, oh, it's back to where it was, because you're not imposing any kind of geometrical structure. It's just, we can't even relate to what that must have been like. I kind of went over some of this yesterday, but the source of the Greek tradition are these two legendary figures who wrote a work that is now lost, but is quoted by other authors like Valens. Our tradition gets passed to the Persians and the Arabs in the Latin West, and I just put William Lilly there. Rudyard, American, an import to America, who Rob has talked about in earlier lectures, and then I just threw Liz Green as a 20th century astrologer that everyone would know. So I mean, this is kind of my 1 second history of Western astrology. But notice, we go from Greek to Persian to Arabic to Latin to English. These are all the languages that's the minimum amount of languages that our tradition passes through. Of course, there's German astrologers and French and all that stuff too, but there's a lot of hurdles. It's very weird. If you look at, I know a little bit of Sanskrit, and when I'm reading the medieval material or even the Arabic material that's quoting Indian stuff, they completely mangle the names. And I should talk to Rob about that. It's kind of a mystery to me. Could they just not hear things correctly? You think you could phonetically get in the ballpark, but it's completely mangled. Like when they talk about what the deities are called in India, it's, completely mangled. All right.
Sorry, Kenneth?
Yes.
In terms of the timeline, is it because a lot of the information was lost and it was written in Arabic that some of the information is still there? It's not like it's from the Arabs, but it was the writings that was translated to get information.
That's an excellent question. So, when the Arabs and Islam, and when I say Arabs, I'm talking about the spread of Islam, and they conquered Persians, and they burned all their astrology books, they did cull some of that into what we now call the Arabic tradition, and we have a gentleman here from Iran, and apparently there is some surviving Persian stuff that we in the West don't know about yet that's like languishing in libraries and whatnot. So we might fill in that piece of the puzzle. Also, some Persian astrology survives in India as well, because there was exchange of ideas there. But I guess my point is that, well, actually an interesting thing happened. So in the Latin West, they're basically inheriting the Arabic tradition, but since Christianity hates Islam back then, thank God we're in a modern, more enlightened age, they're like, well, this astrology's got to be crap. Let's go back to the original Greek stuff, not realizing that the Arabs had like taken the Greek on. And so they go back to Ptolemy. That's why if you know nothing about the history of astrology, you at least have heard Ptolemy somewhere, because that was like, oh, that's a Greek guy. That must be the true astrology. And so that's what would be, that was like really grabbed onto. So immediately, kind of a chunk of the tradition gets lost due to this cultural bias. Same thing happens in medicine. You know, ancient Western medicine would have gone further along if they had paid attention to what the Arabs were doing, who were quite advanced in medicine. But again, it was like, those heathens can't possibly be doing anything right, so we're not going to, they can't teach us anything. And the same thing happens in astrology. And it's really only now that we have an embarrassment of riches with regards to all this ancient knowledge that's been translated into English. Okay. And in my previous lectures I talked, so two things happen. There's all these language and cultural breaks in the Western tradition, and then there's a scientific revolution that also causes a problem for astrology, because now it's like that nothing revolves around the earth. Astrology's a bunch of bull. Indian history, now there's basically one guy who's done the lion's share of the scholarly work in this area, and his name is David Pingree. He's no longer with us. Rob mentioned him. He knew a whole bunch of languages: Arabic, Sanskrit, Akkadian, which is the ancient Babylonian language, and he translated stuff. His specialty was like the history of science, astrology, but he actually did not like astrology, and he was still alive back when I first started my master's degree, and one of my fellow students actually contacted him to interview him, and it was really weird. I mean, he's this brilliant guy, but he kind of hated astrology, and I believe he wrote this article called Astral Omens and something, and in the introduction to that article he says, astrology is so weird and irrational. There's no horoscopic astrology. There's no possible way that more than one culture could have come up with the idea. It must have originated in one place and then spread everywhere else, because it's so nutty. I mean, he actually says this. I'm not exaggerating it. You could read it. And but one of the good things he does is he goes through, he dates a bunch of texts by seeing who quotes whom. There's a whole scholarly way to kind of figure out when things were written. And so a lot of what I'm going to present as the scholarly side of this thing is based on Pingree. But the important thing about Indian astrology, and someone was asking me why was I interested in it, is that it is an unbroken tradition. And what I mean by that is Sanskrit is still a known language. It hasn't had to be translated. It's dialed into the religious culture, and it's never had a conflict with Indian science until very, very recently. So even now, when I go to India and people find out I'm an astrologer, I'm like instantly accorded respect that I never experience anywhere else. Because they just respect their astrologers. Okay, so here's India, here's ancient Sumer, and Greek and Rome are just off the map over here. We'll see a second map a little later. And this is just showing you sort of how close everything was, and I'll be getting into trade and how these different cultures would have talked to each other at different points in the time stream. But I just thought I'd kind of throw up a map to, there'd be there were a couple of ways. You could take the long way, or you'd go overland and then sail a ship to India, and there was trade going back and forth, which we'll learn in a minute. Okay. As a history of science person and as also a religious studies person, I just want to differentiate between what I will call like the scholarly approach to history and the believer's approach to history. And that is, believers tend to have a tradition and myths around things, and then scholars kind of just go with what the physical evidence is. And I'm going to be presenting you more the scholarly side, but I'd mean no disrespect to the believer side. So for an example, in Buddhism, what everyone agrees is the earliest strata of Buddhism is Theravada Buddhism, and there's a set of texts there. And then later in that tradition comes the Mahayana and all these texts that we know did not exist in early Buddhism. But the believers will say that those texts existed on like the astral plane, and when people were ready, they then got revealed to everyone. A scholar will say they were just written later. So again, I'm not claiming one's more right than other. I'm just illustrating the difference between those two, and we don't really need to spend time on that. So there is a big problem when we think of who invented horoscopic astrology. Right now, the evidence is in favor of the West, that the Hellenistic, the Greek-speaking Egyptians, and the whole Hellenistic Empire, they were the first ones that cast a horoscope, and then it spread to India. That's what Rob will say, that's what every Western scholar will, that's what David Pingree would say. Everyone would say that. But there's a problem with that. Rob mentioned it, but I'm actually going to show it to you. Let's see where we're going. Okay, the first is not much survives on the Indian side. In fact, there's a lot missing from both sides. There's a huge civilization that stands in the middle of all this called the Indus Valley Civilization, whose language we haven't cracked yet, that probably had something to do with ancient astrology, but we just don't know. As Rob said, most of the cities are underwater. What's above water is being studied, but we haven't. It's just like Egyptian was 150, 200 years ago. No one knew what the hieroglyphics meant, until they found the Rosetta Stone, which translated some phrases into multiple languages. There's been no similar find of the Indus, so it's a big mystery what they were saying. But all we have are little pieces of the puzzle. And if you've ever put a jigsaw puzzle together, you get a few pieces together and you think, oh, this is it. This is the cloud. This is the cloud part of the picture. But it could be the, picnic mat that's white. You don't know. Sometimes you jump to the wrong conclusion because you have so few pieces. The other problem is, as I mentioned, the Mesopotamians wrote on clay, which is really good at surviving time. Here are some actual examples of astrological stuff. Here's a little stone from 1581 BCE talking about Venus, what Venus is doing in the sky. When we go to India to see, well, what does that literature look like? They wrote on bark, basically, and leaves. This that you're looking here is 50 years old, 50. It rots. And unless someone recopies it all the time, you lose stuff. So there is tons of ancient Indian history that we just know nothing about because nothing has survived practically. So of course, the weight, as Rob said, the weight of the evidence is on the western side because Egypt was a dry climate, so the papyrus survived. Sumerians wrote on clay, that survived. With a notable exception, practically nothing survives from the Indian tradition. Thankfully, Ashoka the Great, who ruled 273 to 232, he conquered a large section of India, unifying it, what we now call India, unifying it, and thank God, he erected stone pillars with messages on them that have survived. Until these were found, Western scholars didn't even believe this guy existed. In fact, when I first started at Kepler College, one of my professors, not Rob, someone else, another famous scholarly type astrologer, I wrote in my essay, well, we know that Ashoka sent ambassadors to the Hellenistic Empire because he wrote on the stone, that's what he did. And I got back, you just can't be making crap up, that, and I was like, I'm not making anything, so I had to dig up all my references. But even now, it's not every Western scholar, they tend to kind of ignore India, to be honest with you. But thank goodness Ashoka did right. So we know, and actually we know that there was trade before then, and I'll bring that into the picture. So, Western history kind of assumes that, or Western historians sort of assume that everything kind of generated out. We have this sort of, the Greeks, they were so smart and had, time to figure all this stuff out. And they sort of ignore everything else and say that India got, learned their horoscopy from the West. The Hindu response, there's been a recent, and by recent I mean like in the last 20 years, this sort of counter thing where they're saying, no, we invented horoscopy thousands of years ago, and they're pushing the dates, these are more believers, way back into like almost absurd levels of time that probably aren't true, quote unquote. But you can understand the need to do that because sort of the history of India has been squashed. So for example, another problem with the history of astrology is that it's being done mostly, until very, very recently, by non-astrologers. So the earliest text in Sanskrit, which is called the Yavana Jataka, Pingree translated into English, and he said, oh yeah, this looks like a Greek text translated into Sanskrit, and he draws all these parallels to Dorotheus, who's another surviving Greek writer. But me as an astrologer, when I looked at what he thought was the same thing, it was not the same. He was making a mistake that a non-astrologer would make. I mean, the Yavana Jataka goes into all this like weird detail about how to deal with transits. Dorotheus just sort of vaguely talks about transits, and Pingree was like, oh, transits, it's the same. So I'm actually working on a project now that sort of pulls the Yavana Jataka out of this mess. So, Yavana Jataka, that's the earliest surviving manuscript we have in India about astrology. And it's often translated Astrology Jataka of the Greeks, Yavana. This is what Yavana actually means. Sometimes applied to Ionia, Greece, Bactria, more recently to Arabia, and sometimes it just meant any foreigner. It would be like a generic term for foreigner. They would say Yavana. Jataka, amongst its many meanings, is a nativity or an astrological calculation of a nativity. Now, think about this. A book is published called the Yavana Jataka. Jataka is already a word that means horoscope, astrological tradition, and would it make sense to use, if it was brand new to India, you would have called it like Horoscopus Yanava, because you'd have to borrow a word to explain it. The mere fact that it's called the Yavana Jataka indicates that there were other Jatakas around. Does that make sense? Now, there is influence. All these guys were talking to each other for a long, long time for reasons you'll see. But when you actually read this text, it's got so much stuff that's only in Indian astrology, it's insane. It's almost crazy to think that it must have been some Alexandrian manuscript that was translated into Sanskrit, because it's got the weird Indian aspect doctrine, which is different than the Western doctrine. It's got the Indian deities all over it. It's got these divisional charts that don't have any analog in the Western tradition, and there's just all these things that are there. Varmahira is like one of the great historical astrologers of Indian astrology. He lived in around 500. He made this stunning prediction to the king that came true, and he became famous. And his work has survived the ages because people made sure they copied that, because it was like a kind of a bedrock text even to this day. They say you need to study Varmahira. And one of his books, which is called the Brihat Samhita, and it goes into kind of sky omens and things that are a little bit beyond. He's got a book on analyzing a natal chart, and then this book goes into other things that we now tend to ignore: sky phenomenon, comets, natural phenomenon, omens. But he does talk about astrology as well, and actually it's in that book where he lists all the characteristics of what make a good astrologer, one of which is being able to kind of hold your own in an argument in an assembly, which shows you how long astrologers have been arguing with each other. But when Pingree translated it, there's a paragraph where Pingree translates Varmahira saying, "Oh, those Greek astrologers, they're so great, and we like learned our tradition from them." But when you read that paragraph translated by an Indian, it's different. It reads different. It says the Yavanas, yeah, the science has found a stable position with them, and in their world they're honored as sages. Our people should be honored all the more, since we're like even super greater with astrology. And that's actually how it reads. But again, whenever you approach the material with a certain bias, and every scholar has to worry about this, you're gonna shift things and selectively read things and see things. Another problem is that at the time that horoscopic astrology is invented, east or west, you had what we call Indo-Greek kingdoms in India. These were Greek rulers that set up like little city-states, but then their people like completely interbred with the locals. We have coins surviving from this age, and in fact the Yavana Jataka is dedicated to one of the kings during this time period. And the influence, just think about this. If you're looking at the sky and you're making connection of things, it only takes one person to go, you know what, I bet if we cast a chart for the moment someone was born, that's probably meaningful. And if I tell you that, and you're also in a world that looks at astrology, you're going to go, oh my God, it's a great idea. Why didn't I think about it? I mean, it just takes one conversation to spread that super great idea everywhere. That's why it's so hard to disentangle this stuff. Now, sometimes you'll hear arguments that there's certain Greek words in Indian astrology that don't have an analog in Sanskrit. Therefore, they must have learned all of astrology from Greek. But we have a lot of words that we borrow from other cultures. That doesn't mean we don't. You think no one put ice cream with their dessert before we imported the French term a la mode? I don't know if you use that here. We use that in the U.S. Do you think no one thought about, we used to call it animal magnetism, the energy that runs through the body. Now we call it chi because we like brought that word in. But that doesn't mean we didn't have a concept of some sort of subtle energy in the body. So the earliest text we have that actually talks about the sky or zodiac things or nakshatras, lunar mansions, is the Vedanta Jyotish, which is like a limb of the Vedas that deals with, quote, astrology. But it's not, and it's dated, Pingree dates it to 400, but it actually mentions some astronomical phenomenon that pushes the date way back. And it probably goes way back, because this was the book that taught you how to calculate where things were so you could do the religious rituals at the proper time. So that's like a key piece of information in ancient Indian religion, as it is now. It mentions the nakshatras. It doesn't mention horoscopes. It's focused on, here's how you do calendars, here's how you figure out, when to do rituals to certain gods. But it does divide the sky into 27 tiny constellations called nakshatras. That's what lunar mansions are. In the West, you just sort of divide the tropical zodiac into these tiny things, but there's actually tiny little constellations, groups of stars that become these 27 nakshatras that form the circle. If you divide 360 by 13 degrees and 20 minutes, you get 27. Okay, so I'm not going to get into it because it's kind of boring, but there are references in the Vedas to astronomical phenomena. I'm going to cover a couple of easy ones here, just to show that the sidereal zodiac was being, looked at by India. And basically, what I'm trying to do here is just put a reasonable doubt. I can't prove. We don't really have the evidence that Indians invented the horoscope, and there's even a movement now to say that they didn't even use the sidereal zodiac, like that came somewhat later. And Rob kind of made a reference to that. And I think that's false. I think we can definitely show, if you carefully look at the text, that they were paying attention to the stars. They were always paying attention to the stars. And then there are just certain weird things that are unexplained. So if you look at the history of Babylon, they had a completely different way of tracking movement in the sky. And then suddenly, around 500 or so, the zodiac gets, the division of 12 suddenly appears in the literature. So this guy Powell did his PhD thesis on the zodiac problem. He also, like everyone else, believes that the West invented it. But even his own writings is like, God, it's kind of weird. It just like pops out of nowhere, this like division by 12. There's a Rig Veda, which is like the earliest Veda which is a Hindu text sacred to Hindus, which is dated possibly conservatively, super conservatively, to 1500 BCE, and most people would push it back much farther than that. It does have this imagery. It doesn't exactly spell things out, but it does talk about the sky having 12 spokes. It does talk about this concept of a wheel in the sky. It mentions number 12. It mentions like degrees and stuff, and it mentions Aquarius as a region of the sky. And there are hints here and there. Just like if you pick up the Bible has astrological references in it, but you couldn't learn astrology from the Bible. It's the same with the Vedas. There are these like references to astrological things. You couldn't actually teach yourself from it. I'm just going to skip all that. Okay. So, sad thing happened on my way to South Africa, which is the notes I had that actually told me exactly what all these dates were, is missing. But basically, these dates all represent exchanges between ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, and India. And I'm going to go into one narrow case of trade in a minute. So if this is something you're interested in, email me, and I'll spell out what happened in the third millennium, because I don't actually remember. But these are all touchstones where there's evidence agreed on both sides of the equation that there was trade and interaction. Ideas follow trade. If you've got Indians going far away, you have foreigners coming into India to trade, ideas get changed around. Definitely there was Silk Road contact. We know that Ashoka sent ambassadors, and we know that Alexander took a saint back with him from India, Alexander the Great. So there are all these contacts that could have very much played a role in the exchange of astrological ideas. Varmahira, again, he was like in our current era, around 550. He writes a book where he kind of summarizes all the mathematical texts that teach you how to actually calculate all this stuff, because of course they didn't have computers back then. And there were like 5 different works. One was called the Roman Book of Calculating Stuff. There was a Greek one, and there were 3 Indian ones. One of which was called the Surya Siddhanta. These are all Siddhanta texts, mathematical texts of how to calculate astronomical stuff. Surya is the sun. And he goes, I've looked at all these, and he kind of summarizes each of them, and he goes, really the sun one that we have is the most accurate. And it is. Like when you look at the mathematics of all of them, it is the best. And that's because, of course, India never had invented zero. Zero was a concept that the West was terrified of for centuries. You'd be shocked at how recent we got zero into schools. And there's a great book called, I think, History of Zero, or Zero, a readable history. It's not very long. It's fascinating. I never thought I'd find the history of a number so interesting, but it is interesting. Aristotle said nothing exists in a vacuum, which means there can't be a zero. And then Christianity rejected zero for a long, long time. That's why, by the way, there is no zero in astrology. That's why there is no 0 year, because there was no zero. If you have a planet that's in 0 degrees and 10 minutes, it's in the 1st degree. That's technically what you would say. And if you have a planet that's in 29 degrees, 15 minutes, that's in the 30th degree, because there is no 0 there.
So, okay, interesting thing is in some of the Hindu scriptures,
yes,
you start counting 1 from 0.
Yes. Yeah, because it wasn't a problem.
No.
Nothingness, emptiness, it's dialed into all, whether you're looking at Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism's previous Brahmanism, it's all huge. I mean, when who was it? Was it Albert? Who went to India and wrote the book India in the year 1000? I'm drawing a blank now. Anyway, there's a book that's available in English, but it's an Arabic. When Islam conquered India, they go in and this guy who's an astrologer goes in and he reports on astrology and all kinds of Indian things. But one of the things he talks about is their number system is insane. There's no way the universe is like billions of years old. Like India was way ahead of the curve on all that stuff. They weren't afraid of big, they weren't afraid of small, they weren't afraid of zero. But we were. Black pepper. Who's ever put pepper on their food? Okay, you participated in a very long tradition. As far as I know, I'm the first person to kind of put this together. But pepper originates in South India. That's what science of plant genetics tells us. In the state of Kerala, that's ground zero for black pepper. All the other black pepper in the world comes from there. So why do we care about black pepper? Well, we know that the pharaoh Ramses II back in 1213 had black pepper stuffed in his nose. We know that because we recovered his mummified remains and pulled out the black pepper, which means Egypt and India must have been trading. And India, when I say Kerala, you know, India is sort of shaped like this. Kerala is down below. It's South India where the black pepper is. So that's like deep into India. So we know trade was going on because pepper got there. And so I forget how I originally stumbled on the pepper argument. I think I came across the fact that pepper originated in India, and I thought, oh, let me see where that goes. And maybe that will give me more information and kind of create an earlier link between these cultures. Greece in the 4th century, we have evidence that they were using black pepper in their cooking. I think there's even a cookbook that survives that talks about adding pepper to things. There's a historian named Strabo who's writing, you know, shortly before the birth of Christ, who mentions, you know, black pepper being imported from India. There's a bunch of 1st century cookbooks that have it. Pliny the Elder writing in 77, and this is all, by the way, this is all the time, you know, we believe that in the West, horoscopes started with an ascendant, you know, started in that like 1 to 200 BCE. So we're like in the early days of like horoscopes appearing in the West. And pepper's already all over the place. And Pliny the Elder writing in 77, he's like, there's no year that India does not drain the empire of 700 million rand. I mean, I translated this into your currency. So they were spending huge amounts of money on black pepper. So we know that as far back as 2000 BCE, Indian cooking is using black pepper. Now, today we think of red pepper. We think of, you know, the red pepper. That was actually brought in by the Portuguese a few hundred years ago. Most of what we think of as, quote, Indian cooking is from New World spice being introduced to India. But in the old days, it was black pepper. We know that Greece had it. We know that Rome was importing it. We know that when the Visigoths conquered the city of Rome, this is the beginning of the end. You know, you can date the fall of Rome a lot of different ways, but one way to date it is the city of Rome falls to the Visigoths. Part of the ransom included, you know, 1360 kilograms of black pepper, because everyone loved their pepper. But where pepper goes, ideas go. Okay, so the astrology of India is called Jyotish. What does that mean? This is the word in Sanskrit, Jyotish, and it means light, and the heavenly bodies, planets, and stars, of course, of the movement. I mean, usually it's translated in modern English as like the science of light, Jyotish, which is why Rob likes it. It's kind of a value-neutral term. Astrologers are called Jyotish. That's Jyotish. Astrologer in India actually means any kind of divination. Like if you travel to India and, oh, you should see the astrologer, make sure that they're doing astrology. They're not doing tarot. They're not doing palm reading. I mean, it's good to get your palm read and all that other stuff, but that's kind of, it's sort of like Chaldean was used in the old world. Anyone that did any kind of divination system was called a Chaldean, including the astrologers. That's how the English word astrology is used in India right now. But Jyotish is the actual Sanskrit word. Okay, Sidereal Zodiac. We have Babylonian astronomy. We know that they were marking the stars because they would say, okay, they would note the position of planets. They had these certain marker stars. Remember, it's not geometry. They didn't have like circles and stuff. I mean, they did divide the sky into like 3 zones, but they had marker stars. They're like, oh, Venus was such and such a distance from this marker star. And now it's approaching this other marker star. As I mentioned, the zodiac kind of arrives out of nowhere in the West. And again, because Pingree thinks there's no way India would have come up with this, it just must have been like the crazy Babylonians. You know, India must have grabbed onto this notion after the Babylonians had it. I'm just going to skip that. So now we're going to get to some real astrology, believe it or not. Sweet. I have a little cheat sheet here. So I just for laughs thought I would look at some of the ingresses of the outer planets into sidereal signs. So now when I use the word sign, I'm going to be talking about sidereal zodiac. Some people say constellational, even though that's kind of a third thing, as I mentioned at the beginning. But now we're going to talk about sidereal zodiac. So Uranus goes into Leo in 1960, and it happens in September of 1960. And right after that happens, we get the first Nixon-Kennedy television debates, which change the way politicians fight each other. Because on TV is a lot different than on radio or newspaper. Nixon was seen as sweating and nervous and didn't present himself very good, and JFK was very charismatic and ended up winning the election. Khrushchev and Castro, within a couple of months of Uranus entering Leo, come to America. By the way, in the sidereal U.S. chart that Western astrologers use, Leo's the 10th house of in that chart of the USA, and it has Rahu and Mercury in it. Mercury, planet of communication. So changes the way politics are fought with the introduction of television. Khrushchev and Castro go to the UN. Castro has a fit. Khrushchev has a fit that, just kind of loses it. There's also, according to Nick Dagan Best, who gave me some of these more obtuse details, there's a Japanese politician who's assassinated on live TV. First time that's ever happened. The outer planets, as you know, go forward, move back, go forward. They often go through things. So Uranus enters sidereal Leo for the last time from June of 61 till November of 66. A lot of interesting things happen during that time, but one thing that popped into my mind, because I'm a James Bond fan and the new James Bond movie is out, is the first James Bond movie comes out. And that James Bond strikes me as kind of a Uranus and Leo kind of guy, if we're going to use outer planets. And it becomes a super popular international figure that now, 50x years later, we're still getting James Bond movies. And a lot of other interesting things happen. Okay, Uranus enters Capricorn just a couple months before September 11th, when the Twin Towers come down in the United States. Uranus is very disruptive, disrupting state Capricorn. Neptune goes into sidereal Capricorn just before, like 2 months before, the economic crash in the United States, which involved this sort of imaginary bubble of real estate values and corruption and illusion and fiscal malfeasance and whatnot. Pluto goes into sidereal Libra just after the American election that year, when Ronald Reagan is elected, and when he takes office, about 6 weeks after Pluto going into Libra, he becomes what we call the Teflon president. No matter what scandal came up, nothing would stick to this guy. Like, just nothing brought him down. I mean, even to this day, he's like revered by the U.S. conservatives now. who've, practically written a hagiography of him. But for those of us that lived through the years, it was kind of tough. Although, ironically now, his kind of conservatism is at the liberal end of American conservatism. I mean, it's gone so far to the right. Okay, so someone asked me this morning, how can you be both? How can you be both tropical? How can both charts be right? And I have several answers for that. And I appreciate your indulgence through all the history we walked through. And before I jump into the practical stuff, I'll just say I hope I've at least created a reasonable doubt that it's quite possible that Indians were the first to come up with the horoscope and transmitted it to Greece, because we did have kind of these Greco-Indian Yavanic kingdoms in India at this time. There had been trade. India had always been watching the sky, like the Egyptians. They'd always been watching the sky, which is where we get no one argues that the nakshatras came from anywhere else. And that's all I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to leave the door open until we find more manuscripts. I mean, the legendary source of Western astrology, this Netshepso and Petasiris. My dream is that one day we do find the papyrus of that, and Netshepso's like, I've just come back from India. That would be great. That'd be great news for the Indian side of this equation. I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter for us practicing astrologers who came up with what, but there are two cultures that had a need for astrology, one because they believed in fate, the other because of karma. And astrologers in both cultures were trying to service their clients. Now, how can you be both a Taurus moon in your tropical chart and an Aries moon in sidereal, where the definitions of Taurus and Aries are so radically different? How is that possible? Well, it's very easy. Things don't mean exactly the same in Indian astrology that they do in Western astrology. There is overlap for sure, but there are differences. And in the case of the moon, in the West, our understanding of the moon is it's our emotional nature. It's, when we feel vulnerable. It's that part of ourselves that developed early on. Am I representing the Western viewpoint accurately? Or are we all Jyotishis here? And in Indian astrology, the moon is your whole mind. It's your whole perceptual field. It's how you process information. So when I have a client sitting in front of me who's had Western readings before, I will, and I know that they're having this problem of the two zodiacs in their mind, I will just describe their Western moon, and then I'll explain, and I'll say, okay, so emotionally you're like this, but however, your mind really functions like an Aries, and I'll just, describe that quality, and that will fit. I mean, if you do this to yourself, it should work. It's just like Chinese medicine and Western medicine, unfortunately, share the same vocabulary. There's a liver in Chinese medicine, there's a liver in Western medicine. But in Chinese medicine, the liver is the organ, it's the emotions associated with the organ, it's the meridian. And in the West, it's the organ as a filter through which all the junk of our body gets passed through. And we've really dialed into the structure of the liver in the West. There is overlap between the two, but they're both referring to different things. This is why, probably doesn't happen here, but in America, quite commonly, the acupuncturist will be like, oh, you've got a sluggish liver. And that person runs to their Western medical doctor, my liver's sluggish. And they're like, what are you talking about? And your blood test numbers are perfect. Because they weren't talking about the same thing. So in Indian astrology, we have, we use the same words, but they mean slightly different things. We also have different rules, things aspect each other differently. So if you go to see a good Western astrologer and a good Indian astrologer the next day, I mean, the information should overlap. It should be good, both readings should be good, and they will overlap for different reasons. They'll see things differently. And now we're going to look at Steve Jobs in both charts, just to kind of illustrate this point. So this is the tropical wheel. I'm sorry it's so light. It's got Virgo rising, and he's got the moon in Aries with Mars. Very wide. I mean, you wouldn't consider that in modern Western astrology. They wouldn't consider that conjunct. Moon's at 8 degrees and Mars is in the 30th degree. But What do we know? The new movie just came out. We know that he was quick to temper. You know, he'd argue, he'd yell at his people. He's getting kind of a bad rap because of how tough he was with people and how argumentative his nature was. We've had like a whole bunch of movies. Steve Jobs is the founder of Apple, by the way, Apple Computer. And he had quite a temper, as has come out in all these biographies and people that used to work with them, and in the new movie that has just come out. Well, that makes sense to me. Now, if we look at his Indian chart, this is the sidereal chart in the South Indian style. If you've never seen this chart before, each box is a house. It's whole sign houses like Rob taught this morning. So it's got Leo rising, so all of Leo becomes the first house, and you just go clockwise around the chart. Aries is always in this box. Aries, Taurus, blah, blah, blah. And you note the rising sign by either putting LG for Lugna, which is the Sanskrit word for ascendant, or sometimes you'll see ascendant, or sometimes you'll see lines. But that marks the first house, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So the first house could be in any position, the
Yes.
signs stay in exactly
Yes.
the same place.
In other words, in this chart, it's actually, if we have time at the end and you want to stay and you're interested, I will show you why I believe this chart format is the best chart format in the world, west or east, because it actually more accurately shows you the sky in 2 dimensions. And I will prove that to you with a couple of slides. But I figured at the end because it's a little off topic. But yes, this stays fixed because it's the Earth that's moving. The fixed stars aren't moving, it's the Earth that's moving in the middle. It's the ascendant that's moving around them. It's a trick of the way Western astrology does astrology, that it rotates everything else. But I mean, this is actually more accurately depicting what's happening. But it's also easy, if you know that Aries is always here, it's very easy for you to, like, if you're doing compatibility work or looking at more than one chart, you can easily put those 2 charts on top of each other to see, even in your mind. Like, once you get this in your head, it's very easy to, like, track a whole bunch of charts because the basic frame of it is the same for everyone. You're just rotating the ascendant around. All right, so what do we got here? Here we have Leo rising and the sun in the 7th house. Now, the sun doesn't mean the same thing in both systems. In the West, we tend to think of the sun as kind of a personality indicator. In Indian astrology, it's really the rising sign that describes the character. Now, here we have and he's Leo rising, so that does make him sun-like. And what was he known for? He was known for his, he was a rock star in that world. I mean, people would go to those Apple conferences and wait for the unveiling of things. It was Steve Jobs. I mean, he was brought back to the company after being kicked out because his personality was his charisma was such a glue to all the Apple fanatics. What else do I want to say about this? 7, 8, 9. He does have a strong Mars. It ends up being in Aries in the 9th house here. His moon goes to the 8th house, which is not a great position, but there's a rule in Indian astrology that when the rule of the 12th goes to the 8th, it's a good thing. I often think that sometimes one of the differences between Indian astrology and Western astrology is that Indian astrology tends to show the movie camera view of your life. And Western astrology, modern psychological Western astrology, tends to show like how you're reacting to the world from inside your head. Now, that's not hard and fast. I mean, Indian astrology can do a bang-up job on psychological analysis, and traditional Western astrology can do a great job on predicting outer events. So I'm not saying both systems can't do it. But generally, the way they're practiced by the majority of modern psychological astrologers, I think that's a fair change. Because a lot of times this chart will show family members and what's happening around you. It's like the movie camera view of your life, giving kind of an objective view of what's going on. In Indian astrology, to give an idea of what's going on in somebody's head, they'll start from the moon. The moon is the mind. So they'll look at the chart, okay, well, from his mind, he's got moon in Pisces. He's an idea guy. He's pushing the boundaries. He wanted rounded corners on those early Mac screens instead of square because it was more in nature. He took a walk in nature, saw this round stuff, and he went running back. He's like, our windows have to be rounded on the corners. And the guys were like, are you kidding me, dude? We gotta get this to market. But from the moon, Mars is in the second house, very strong. Second house is the house of speech, and he was argumentative. So without being crazy manipulating the chart, I'm getting similar information the Indian way, looking at the Indian chart, that I got from the Western chart using the Western way, which is how it should work, and which is why there can be, you know, two zodiacs. Now here's both charts together. Any questions?
Yes, you looked at the ascendant on that side.
Yes, so just to make it bigger. So this, you can't, I didn't realize it was going to be outside. This slide would have shown up better indoors. But there's two lines here that denote the rising sign. So that's how we know that Leo is here, because the signs themselves are fixed in this chart. So, and it goes clockwise, the opposite direction of a Western chart. So Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo. Anytime you pick up a book on Indian astrology, anytime you see this format, even if they haven't labeled, and there are teeny labels in here, you just probably can't see them, that says AR for Aries. But even if that wasn't there, you would know, oh, that box is Aries. And then you would look for either lines, or the word ascendant, or LG, or the word lugna. I mean, those all mean the same thing, the rising degree. Yeah?
Sorry, can I go off this one? It's just something that's been going
Yes.
through my mind. So theoretically, you cannot actually then take Western astrology and apply it to a sidereal zodiac, because all your meanings of everything change. You'd have to add the meanings of the sidereal zodiac in order for it to have...
Yes. That's what I would argue. But I hear Kenneth, what's his name, you know, arguing for his little Western sidereal zodiac, but the vast majority of people would say...
Because if you've got
yes.
somebody who's always grown up to know themselves as being a Leo,
Mhm.
and now you're moving them to be a Cancer, they're not going to relate to that, surely. Because you can't suddenly take a Leo and give them Cancerian.
But see, you wouldn't do that.
That's what I'm asking.
Because you're going to say, the sun is way down on our list of considerations. We're going to look at the rising sign.
But you
And they
have
will
to-
relate to the rising sign in the sidereal zodiac.
But you'd have to apply then the...
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
It's two languages.
Yes.
So another model is, it's not that you can only do one or the other. You can do both. Just like you can have a medical doctor trained in Oriental medicine. It's just you keep the models separate. I do some class, like a week after I leave South Africa, in San Francisco, I'm doing a lecture to two Western astrologers on the nodes. And I'm going to show them, here's the button you click on your software to turn on the sidereal zodiac for a second. Let's look at how the nodes look there. I'm going to give you a bunch of information, and now you can go back to your chart, and you just add that information in.
Don't you want to do that one here too?
You know,
No time.
I submitted 20 topics, and they picked the 3 nerdy ones. So that's what you're getting from me. But yes.
Is that a Southern Indian chart?
Yeah, this is the Southern India chart. It's actually the chart I use, and it's considered, well, actually, we'll get into that in a little bit. It's considered the more traditional form because when Islam conquered the north of India, that's when you get the North Indian chart style that looks like the medieval Western chart. But I do have a slide for that.
So how do you know what houses they're in? I mean, real houses they're in when they always have the top as Aries?
Because you look for the ascendant, and that creates the first house, and then you go clockwise around. So you can't see it, but there's a double line here in
Yeah.
degrees telling you if there's 29.
So wherever the lambda is, that's your first house? and
Yes,
you go
it's a whole sign house
clockwise.
system.
Yeah.
So you identify the lugna, that's 1, and you go around clockwise.
So what would be the meaning of the 8th house now here in the Indian system? Because now his mind is in the 8th house.
Yeah, so the 8th house is research. I mean, now we're playing the astrology as 2020. You know, if I didn't know anything about Steve Jobs, I might pick a different keyword. But we can go into research. We can go into, he did transform, you know, Apple, in a sense, allowed, in a non-business context, you know, all of PCs. I mean, what Windows ended up mimicking the graphic interface of Mac, and so I mean, really, Apple did have a huge. I mean, I'm a PC person. I mean, I don't use Mac products, but clearly in the development of personal computers, Apple had a huge impact in mouse, graphic interface, what you see is what you get. I mean, all that stuff was like, ooh, that's such a good idea. Let's bring it over onto the PC side. And again, there's this yoga or this combination that when the ruler of the 12th is in the 8th, it means that what would normally be a bad place, the 8th house, becomes good for certain things, and you might want to go for more positive keywords. Yes?
Steve Jobs with Mercury in the 8th, he also stole those ideas from Xerox company.
Yeah, he stole the mouse from Xerox. Yeah.
And the graphic interface.
Yeah. So
So
actually,
that was
it's
a
in the
product
it's in the
for
6th
that.
here, but yeah, it's the 6th. Yeah.
An interesting thing about Steve Jobs is a classic example of the Rashi chart, which is the horoscope that you're looking at, doesn't actually show the true identity. If you didn't know who Steve Jobs was, right, and what he was all about and what he did, you can't actually tell from the chart what his vocation is.
Right.
So the other tools in the toolbox, which actually then describes it further, is your dashamsha.
Right.
Which,
Beyond the scope
yeah.
of today, but yes.
Yeah, so what actually happens is that you take the 10th house and then you expand it further,
Yeah.
and that's how the two systems can actually work simultaneously,
Yeah.
but just with different tools that you're using.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they'll both generate useful information. Okay. So, in conclusion, I can see people pouring in for what I presume is the next lecture. How can all these crazy different systems of astrology be right? Because frankly, there are good astrologers representing all these, well, maybe not all of them, but most of them, there are some good astrologers that represent them, and their clients keep coming back. So how do we explain all that? Well, there's something that I call the mantic effect of astrology. Mantic is like the divinatory component of astrology, which drives me crazy because I like my astrology to be rule-driven, as scientific as I can make it. But the fact is, there is some magic that happens between the client and the astrologer, and that your personal astrology also affects the type of client you're getting. James Braha, famous American Indian astrologer who wrote one of the early texts by an American on Indian astrology, in his book he goes, Jupiter in the 12th house is this like great wonderful thing. Jupiter in the first house is this great wonderful thing that in Indian astrology they say like removes 100,000 blemishes of the chart. And he says in his book, you think I would see this at least 1/12 out of my clients, but I like rarely see it. So it must be a very rare factor that pops up. And I remember reading that going, are you kidding me? I see that all the time. But the difference is I'm in San Diego seeing middle and upper middle class clients, and he's in rural Florida close to a Hare Krishna ashram. So of course he's not going to see it as much. So where you are, your chart, the kind of person that comes to you, this is why it's tough to sometimes generalize, just as one practitioner, to generalize some universal rule, because there's a weird self-selecting process going on. But I think that if two people are getting together with the highest ideal of how can I help this person, there's a magic that comes in that allows the psychological astrologer, the cosmobiologist, the Indian astrologer, the Western astrologer, even if there is one, quote, right astrology, the fact that both of you are guided by this, hey, I really want to help you, there's a little magic that happens that gets it to work. You wouldn't believe how many clients I get who, when I do a little description of their personality, they say to me, oh, this makes so much more sense than my Western chart. But I don't believe that. There must be a bunch of people that then that go see a Western astrologer and say that and go, oh, this makes much more sense than my Indian chart. It just so happens that my energy is drawing me people that are going to benefit from whatever I have to give them. And I think that's true of any kind of helping relationship. So I've already told you the language model. If you're going to learn both systems, that's great. My recommendation is to keep your glyphs with your circle charts and use the letter abbreviations on your Indian chart so you don't start contaminating the meetings. Because believe me, there are American Vedic astrologers that started in the Western tradition went over into Indian, and they have messed it up. You'll read their description of the moon, and they'll be like, "That's not what Kenneth taught me. This sounds just like the Western moon." And then it does break down, because you can't be both, Aries and Taurus. I already went over the medical model. And then a teacher of mine once told me this thing called the doctrine of imposition, which is any well-formed logical system, when applied to the universe, will generate useful information. The Ptolemaic cosmos worked for a long time. I mean, the mathematics of that, as our observations got more sophisticated, we had to add more circles and get things to work out, and then finally we got the heliocentric. You know why we got the heliocentric model, by the way? Copernicus was trying to find an easier way to calculate stuff for his astrology. Astrology's all over our history. It's just been whitewashed. And you can look that up. Okay, so I don't recommend mixing it up, although you're free to do. I'm not going to be over your shoulder. Yeah, you're free to do whatever you want. But I wouldn't. Some people just sort of mix all the rules together, east and west, and come up with a hodgepodge of stuff. I don't recommend that. Do your Western, then hit that sidereal button, and then select your Ayanamsha, which is the starting of your sidereal zodiac, and then do that. And then the client doesn't want to know the gibberish; they just want to know the English, and then you just give them all the information. When I do relationship astrology, I do Indian classical, and I do look at the tropical chart, because Indian relationship astrology was developed in a arranged marriage culture. And you just can't take all those principles into the West and expect them to work in a serial monogamy dating world. So that's one area where I will do both. But I do them both, and then I present the information to them. We don't have time for Zoller's esoteric astrology, but as a Western medievalist, he wrote a great essay on kind of what medievals called the eighth sphere, which was the sphere of the fixed stars, how to kind of integrate that in a tropical world, and it has to do with a bunch of spiritual things. But what I will say is, there's this tradition in Judaism that Jews are above. Yes, there is a horoscope. There are stellar influences. Do I have to pull the plug? Okay.
Yeah, just about.
Just about. Okay. Well, you'll.
Yeah.
There is this tradition that Jews are above the zodiac because of their, quote, special relationship with God. But when you actually read the Zohar, which is one of the great mystical texts of Jewish Kabbalah, what it's basically telling you is that a person who lives a sacred life, if you're studying your sacred text, if you're being holy, I'm kind of Judaizing the message here, but basically it's saying, if you're following your spiritual path and you're studying your sacred scriptures and you're bettering yourself, that is the secret to rising above the enslaved, fate of the stars. In the magical tradition, in the Picatrix, it actually does bring in the sidereal zodiac, and it tells you that it's very important. We don't have time for that, but if you're interested, you can do that. And now I'm going to leave you with the most radical idea very fast. Future of the zodiac. What happens? I'm going to say that the reason why a tropical zodiac and sidereal zodiac work is because every circle, every meaningful natural circle behaves like the zodiac. The first 30 degrees, think about the natural entrance of your house, let's say, and throw the zodiac around it and see if that first 30-degree section doesn't have an Aries-like energy. I think one of the reasons why it works is that when you have a natural point, whether it's the star of Aries or it's the first day of spring, that would explain why this tropical zodiac works in the southern hemisphere, even though it's fall instead of spring, is because the equinox is a natural starting point of a circle, of a natural circle. And I'm wondering, as we go out into space and do other things, that once we establish what seems to be a logical or meaningful starting point in the sky, we can generate that zodiac wherever we go. That's what I call the circle of light theory. Or as we, in millennia, leave Earth, we may have to leave one astrologer behind just to do all the horaries because we don't want to take them out of the zodiac. So that's, I'm actually writing a short story about that concept, the last astrologer on Earth after everyone's left. So just think about that it's, this notion of circle has a zodiac-like quality. The more arbitrary, the weaker it's going to be. But if it's tied to some significant world natural event, like equinoxes, you know, it works. So I think that's the end. We're out of time. And there can be more than one.